Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 1 of the Rookie Faceoff tournament for the San Jose Sharks, in which they took on the Utah Hockey Club. This is the first time we will see the Utah Hockey Club this season, the relocated Arizona Coyotes, and the Sharks managed to win 3-2. Of course, wins, losses don't really matter here. The word tournament in the title of this event is honestly rather misleading because there's no reward for winning. There's no consequence for losing. It's just an opportunity to actually see how your rookies are able to perform in a slightly more competitive environment than a training camp might normally offer. And in the past at Rookie Faceoff tournaments for the Sharks, they haven't necessarily been the best team because of the fact that their prospect pool has been one of the lower ranked ones in the entire league. But this season, clearly the San Jose Sharks are coming in as a big sort of favorite in a lot of the games that they're going to be playing, having one of, if not the best prospect pool in the entire league. And we saw that on full display here today against Utah. They were clearly the better team. They managed to get the victory. They played the majority of the game in the offensive zone for the San Jose Sharks. So an impressive game throughout when it comes to the entire team. But let's look more so individually at each of these players. And we start off with the top line, of course, featuring Macklin Celebrini, and he's flanked by Haltunen and Wetch. Now, starting with Celebrini, I will start with the good news about his game. He showed off really strong speed. This was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see from Celebrini, but he was a very, very fast player on the ice. Perhaps this is because I'm comparing him to the other prospects there who might not be that fast, and once he gets to the actual NHL game, which has an increased level of speed, he'll look a bit more to the average, but it's still a good sign of things to come for sure. He also showed a very good shooting ability. He managed to score a goal here tonight, had a couple of other really good chances as well, and what I really liked from Celebrini that stood out in this particular area is that he wasn't having to benefit from his teammates setting him up, but more so that he was actually he was able to create these chances for himself. And that's really what separates a good scorer from a great scorer, is being able to actually make those chances happen for yourself. And so that was nice to see that Celebrini was able to do so. On the power play, I also very much enjoyed him. His ability to enter the zone pretty much unimposed and unimpeded was quite nice to see. That was something that the Sharks pretty heavily relied on through the 5 power plays, if I'm not mistaken, that they got in this game. So Celebrini managed to thrive in that area. On the more sort of bad news, and I use the word bad rather lightly here because I don't think that this was necessarily a negative for Celebrini, but there was perhaps a certain feeling of him trying to do a little bit too much here tonight. There were a couple of overthought plays, some behind the back passes that just didn't really have much juice on them, or some spinorama moves to then pass up to the point to a player who wasn't actually there. So he kind of overthought a couple of these plays for sure. There was also one major mistake in the third period where he tries to make a defensive play happen himself instead of going for a simple pass to his defenseman, and that backfired heavily and led to a Utah shift in the offensive zone. So that was slightly rough, but I'd say more so than not, Celebrini was a positive, was definitely one of the better players for the San Jose Sharks. And it should also, of course, be noted that these players have come together from around the world, from different areas, the AHL, the OHL, any junior league, college, and overseas, and everything like that, and they're now expected to be able to develop some chemistry on pretty short notice. And in particular for Celebrini, considering he was in Vegas doing some sort of player media event for the NHL, he only arrived in San Jose a couple of days ago. It was always going to be a bit of a tough start to the Rookie Faceoff tournament. Sure, he didn't put up like hat trick levels of a Connor Bedard, but I still thought he was relatively good, and I imagine he'll ramp up as this goes on if he's given another game or two. When it comes to his 2 wingers, this could also be a reason for why maybe Celebrini didn't soar above everybody else. His wingers didn't really perform that well. We'll start off here with Haltunen, who kind of developed this chemistry with Celebrini back at the development camp scrimmage a couple of months ago. They made up a pretty solid duo, but here today, I don't think Haltunen was all that great. He had a couple of looks, in particular in the first period, but then as the game wore on, he really didn't make much of anything actually managed to happen. And considering Haltunen is in a situation where he either is heading back to the OHL or starting his professional career in the AHL, and I imagine his preference is to head to the AHL, this was not necessarily a strong first game to sort of make an argument for that. When it comes to the other winger on this line, Carson Wetch, I know there is some history between Wetch and Celebrini in their youth. They played on the same team, something along those lines. But it feels as though it would have been smarter to kind of surround Celebrini with some really good talent for the Sharks, and that's not necessarily a comment on Wetch, but more so a comment on some of the other players that the Sharks could have played him with. In particular, Cardwell, who would eventually end up making his way up to the top line in the third period, where things would pick up and actually look a lot better. But prior to that, in the first couple of periods, Wetch was more or less invisible. He had like one good shift, but that's about it. And so I thought that was a bit of a weird coaching decision for sure. When it comes to the second line, this was probably the Sharks' best line, at least in the first two periods. The first line ended up coming back up once Cardwell jumped up there, but the second line was definitely the best through the first 40 minutes, and you could see why. They truly loaded up here. Smith and Musty were also a duo that really started to develop at the development camp scrimmage, and then Colin Graf, considering he's the only player currently dressed on this roster today who actually has played in the NHL at some point, has a few games under his belt. It's not a surprise that he would be like a really prized option on this second line, and I thought Graf, to start with him, looked really, really strong. He probably kept it a lot more simple than a lot of the other players on the San Jose Sharks who tried to maybe show off a bit and show off their elite talent. Graf knows the type of player he is. He knows the type of player he needs to be, I imagine, thanks to the few games he had in the NHL near the end of last season. And I thought he really worked towards sort of being a positive for the San Jose Sharks here today. Played a very north-south game, didn't overcomplicate, kept things relatively simple, which led to him being one of the better players for the Sharks for sure. And it was a nice first step to trying to still manage to earn a spot in the lineup in the NHL for the Sharks this next season, as difficult as that will end up being. When it comes to Will Smith, the other big name for the San Jose Sharks in the lineup here, he also had some very real positives in his game. He showed off a ton of offensive talent for sure, in particular in the earlier parts of this game where he was setting up some really, really nice plays. But we also saw some negative aspects of his game creep in. I talked about actually a few days ago where Will Smith could go for these high-risk plays that can work out in these more lax environments or these easier environments, but as he gets to the NHL, they're going to be much more difficult to actually pull off. And we actually saw early on in this one where Will Smith goes for an aggressive cross-ice pass east-west. He goes from the boards to the far side point, and it ends up getting picked off. It doesn't lead to a goal against or any sort of offensive zone time, so that was kind of a best case scenario, but it can very much backfire, especially at the NHL level. So he has to be able to rein that in and not necessarily make those types of plays unless he's really, really sure that they can actually work out. On top of that, I would say Will Smith, while he did commit a bit more to trying to be like a well-rounded kind of defensive type of player, I won't necessarily say he had much success in that particular area. Some lapses in coverage for sure in the defensive zone that left a little bit to be desired, but I would say the good outweighed the bad. Maybe not as much as in the case of Celebrini, but he was still a decent player, and hopefully he can also ramp up as this tournament goes on. When it comes to the final member on this line, Quentin Musty, there was a lot of eyes on him, not necessarily because he's like the super high potential. He's not at the Celebrini and Smith level, though he is definitely one of the Sharks' best prospects, but more so because he wants to be able to make an impact at this rookie faceoff tournament and at this training camp so that he could have a chance of making it to the NHL. Otherwise, he has to head back to juniors, which is something that I'm sure he doesn't want to do. And so this was a first game to be able to do that, to be able to take those first steps, and I don't really think he managed to accomplish that goal. That's not to say that he was bad here tonight. As with most of the Sharks players, they were all good at a baseline because of just how good the Sharks were and how much better than they were than the Utah Hockey Club. But the thing for Musty is I was expecting that big offensive explosion. I was expecting him to be able to just muscle his way through on the ice and just outplay players and deke them out and make the plays and push people off pucks. And I didn't really see a ton of that. The Sharks clearly have decided to try and play him in more of like a net front role, and I think he does exceed. He will actually be able to succeed in that particular position. We saw him on the power play actually have a lot of success here today with that, just from being able to be a nuisance to the goaltender in front. Was a big reason for why Celebrini was actually able to get the goal that tied this game up at 2. But when it came to his even strength play, while it was good, it wasn't great, and I don't think it's really going to be that big difference maker for him. I'm not necessarily hoping for him to ramp up. I think it needs to ramp up if he really wants a chance of being able to be a San Jose Shark this season. When it comes to the third line, we have Bistad joined by Mitchell Russell and Ethan Cardwell. I'll start with Cardwell because, as I said, he was bumped up to the first line in the third period, and he, like with Colin Graf, is someone who keeps it very, very simple, and it's perhaps that extra experience, as this being his fourth rookie faceoff tournament. He has the AHL experience as well, that he's able to actually do that. He was pushing pucks on net. He wasn't trying to do too much and be too fancy and make these passing plays behind the back it up to the point and things like that. He worked it onto the net, and I think that was a real big benefit not only to him, but also to Celebrini, who looked his best, I would say, in that third period. Cardwell would end up scoring the game-winning goal, which was quite nice to see, and I feel as though he was probably one of the best Sharks players on the ice today. I also want to say, as I've mentioned many times in the past when discussing Cardwell, he's definitely one of my favorite Sharks prospects that they do have, not because of there's like an immense amount of talent there. I'm not expecting him to be a first liner, but I just love how hardworking he is. We also saw the Sharks take a single penalty this game. He was part of the penalty killing unit, and I thought he did a great job in that area, and just generally, I really enjoy him as a prospect. When it comes to the other two players on his line, Philip Bystedt, it was always going to be a bit of a tough spot, considering he is a centerman. He wasn't really going to get much time with either Celebrini or Smith, if any time at all, with those two players. Instead, he would be stuck with other wingers, and no offense to players like Russell or like Wetch, they're not the best of the best that the Sharks actually have to offer. So Bystedt is going to be put in a tough position in this case. I thought he was okay. Nothing amazing, but again, it wasn't necessarily put into a position to succeed, so I thought it was decent, but maybe you were hoping for a little bit better. And then we have Mitchell Russell. He's been around the San Jose Sharks for a bit now. In the last couple of years, I feel as though he's been at these rookie faceoff tournaments. He's always someone who's been solid, but isn't really catching your eye either. I wouldn't really say he's much of a notable name here today. And then when it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, these are more the players who are more so hoping for that AHL ice time compared to NHL ice time within the next couple of years. The standout, I would say, was probably Granger, considering he did score a goal, and even prior to that in the first period, he looked really, really good. As the game wore on, he really faded into the background, didn't really make much happen in either the second or the third period. And it should also be noted that Granger is 25 years of age, which means he is significantly older than a lot of the players here involved, not only on the Sharks, but throughout most of the teams at this rookie face-off tournament. So he does have just a general sort of physically developed advantage, so I wouldn't necessarily write too much home about him. Then we move on to the defensive side of things, and leading the way, interestingly enough, we had Luca Cagnoni. I thought Dickinson would actually be put into this position, being the 11th overall pick, but not only has Cagnoni managed to get the spot on the Sharks' top defensive pairing, if you can call it that. It's at least the one that started the game, but he was also the Sharks' #1 defenseman on their power play. He was the one playing with Celebrini and Smith and Musty on this top unit. Dickinson had the second unit instead, and I thought Cagnoni actually had a really good game. He was all over the ice. He was making some solid plays, both offensively and even defensively. If there was one major issue, it goes back to that size problem. He was someone who was able to get pushed off the puck a few times here tonight. Not necessarily pushed off the puck, because he was usually able to make a play with it, but he was getting knocked down multiple times, which is definitely something that is only going to get worse as you get to these more professional levels of play, in particular in the AHL and of course in the NHL within the next few years, if he's actually able to make it. But considering, like with Haltunen, he does have the chance of getting into the AHL this season, it remains to be seen of whether or not he's fully ready to do so. I would say skill-wise he is, but if he's actually able to hang around at that level size-wise, that's another big question. I found it very interesting that he actually got paired with Haché here. So Haché is kind of in a similar situation as the Sharks' fourth line at forwards, where he's sort of like a more AHL type of guy, but I actually thought he played pretty well, was probably the best of these sort of free agent players for the San Jose Sharks. His first shift of the game was not good, but as it went on, he got better and better, and I thought he made a lot of smart choices, and he was also sort of like I wouldn't say like a guardian angel, maybe that's putting it a bit too much, but he was clearly someone who was put there to kind of stand up for Cagnoni. We saw Cagnoni get a big high stick to the face near the end of this third period of this game, and he definitely was willing to get into like these tussles and these physical altercations with the Utah players, so that was nice to see. I actually thought Haché was pretty decent. When it comes to the second pairing, this is where we feature Sam Dickinson. Dickinson, probably the most interesting player of the night for sure, because when he was originally drafted by the Sharks, the scouting report seemed to indicate that he was someone who's more of like a two-way defenseman for the Sharks, that he would be coming in and he would be like at a minimum like a solid second pairing two-way guy, but the big question mark was whether or not he had the offensive upside to be a number one defenseman on a good team, to be a number one power play guy on a good team. But I saw a very different Sam Dickinson here today in this game. Instead, what we saw was more Brent Burns-esque, I felt. He was really roaming all over the ice. He was making these 3-on-2 jump up into the play, odd man rushes. He was pinching in extremely aggressive into his own zone. It was these plays that you would think that this is like a pure offensive guy without much defensive output, and yet he was sort of scouted as someone who would be more of that two-way option. In the defensive zone, I don't think he was bad, but there were a couple of incorrect decisions I felt as though he made. Definitely decision-making is something to work on, and I also had made the comment when he was originally drafted that he might only be like a year away, not this season, but the season after that. From what I'm seeing, this is a very small sample size still, so I'm not going to draw any major conclusions, but from what I'm seeing, he's still a very raw talent. He has a lot of innate skill, but it certainly needs to be honed. He's probably at least a couple of years away from being able to make it onto the San Jose Sharks main roster, but as I said, there is definitely talent there. And if there is one thing that the scouting staff definitely did get right about Dickinson, is that he is a very, very fast skater. He's got a smooth stride. It looks effortless as he moves up and down the ice, but even the fastest skaters can get caught in their own zone if they're playing a little bit too deep, and playing a little bit too deep was basically Sam Dickinson's MO throughout most of this game. Hopefully, he can sort of rein it in slightly and perform more of like a solid game as this tournament wears on. When it comes to his defensive partner, we have Gannon Larocque. Larocque has had a bit of a rough journey over these last couple of years, primarily because he missed pretty much the majority of an entire season due to an injury, which kind of set him back on his development path. Here, this is an opportunity for him to try and get back on track, I would say, and I think this was a strong start. His first period I thought was really, really good. He faded a bit as it went on, but was still relatively solid through the seconds and third periods. So while he didn't have those big name moments that stood out like a Celebrini or like a Cagnoni, I guess, to take more of a defensive option, I thought he was pretty good. And then when it comes to the third defensive pairing, we have Pooley here, who I thought was probably the standout of the third defensive pairing. That's not really saying much because I don't think he was all that great, but he was pretty good. When it comes to Nate Miskey, number 89, the final player to talk about here, he was a bit more below average. You didn't really notice him much, and when you did, it wasn't always in a super positive aspect. But as I mentioned earlier on, generally the Sharks team played quite well, so there's no one who was necessarily super disappointing. Just, it wasn't a standout performance for him. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday for Game 2, and then they'll conclude it on Monday, the rest of the Rookie Faceoff tournament. It should be noted, one bit of update news is that Shakir Mukhamadullin, who was supposed to be participating here, is not going to play in any of the games. He has some lingering issue and injury. He has went back to San Jose to sort of nurse that to be ready for training camp. But with that being said, as this tournament does wear on, we're expecting better and better performances from the Sharks rookies, who were already pretty good here tonight, so that does bode well for things to come. Class dismissed.